Good morning, colleagues. Good morning. I'm really glad to welcome all of you to our session, Investment into Infrastructure and Potential of the Private Investment. We do understand that this issue is really relevant, and it is well identified by the need for some social development, starting from the development of infrastructure. Specifically, in the May decree by the President, he outlined the need to develop it for a period up to 2024. And one of the main priorities will be focused on the budget, and thus, for example, the budget has already been exposed to certain amendments, considering that, of course, some funds will be allocated for needs and will amount to 3 trillion rubles. As of today, we are really working as to how those budgets and funds should be allocated. It was particularly highlighted that we really need to pay particular stress on the efficiency of the investment, and even at the planning stage, we should never forget that there are such problems as, for example, related to the correct distribution of the funds. We also worked with the issue of investment that are now being exposed to intergovernmental approval, which will allow us to analyze the efficiency of the financial instruments used for that matter. As a result, it will definitely help to increase the level of efficiency. To do that, we need to work in cooperation not only with the state, and this is the only one who can do it. That is why we also work with private entities. It's worth mentioning that the practice of cooperation with monitoring bodies plays a particular role in this sense. And I would like to introduce First Deputy of the Monopoly Service Department of the Russian Federation. How do you perceive the main trends in this domain? Dear friends, well, you know, even from scientific practice, when you search for one drug and then you find a different one, even more efficient. Speaking about concessions, we had pretty much scenario. We developed a special law for concessions, but then it turned out that you can also work with some state investment for that matter, and then it was kind of put on the back burner. Right now, this we have a state component in that financing sector, which is prevailing. At the same time, we do understand that infrastructure projects without state participation, without state approval, turn out to be really complicated, and that's why they do really need it. Another question is how we can actually establish the relations with the private sector to make sure that they plays the very right role that state fails to be formed. As for borrowing, for example, when we borrow funds from the bank or some private entities, it's the bank who can do it really efficiently. Another question is why actually the private sector is supposed to do that. Why do we talk about private funds? I think that the answer is all about the same. We think that the private sector, based on its competences and specific features, is more efficient in entrepreneurial activities. So when you try to shift this decision-making process upon the states, is always less efficient, because you have to think about a whole variety of minor things that have an impact on the performance. What is the efficiency of the decision-making process within the governmental structures? You know, we have a lot of officials who approve different strategies, etc., about, for example, hospitals, about different establishments, about informational parameters that needs to be established in order to ensure some and to meet some social demands. We see that, judging from the practice, at least when it's business who does that, then it's more creative, because the business managed to find more front-end, more modern, I would say, solutions, less expensive. Business is guided by its own risk, by its own motivation. And when I say risk, I also mean those related to monetization. And so they find more efficient solutions. That is why the key advantage of the concession and the private-state partnership compared to, for example, state purchase system is that we can really properly distribute responsibility and to allocate every single responsibility responsibility to the right person. Officials, they can take a decision as to how many actually space we can have for and so what number of people in hospitals. But when we talk about hospitals with certain services, with new technologies, etc., this is something that falls within the scope of competence of the state. You know that relevant amendments were introduced to the legislation, and they also become an integral part of the private-state partnership. It's also relevant when we talk about investments and such issues as infrastructure development. Right now, we really lack certitude and special regulatory mechanisms. If we, for example, look at the legislation, and again, I remind you that we have a private-state partnership agreement as well as concession agreement, but why an official cannot just build a hospital based on a concession agreement or based on a private-state partnership agreement, but they never do that. Why? Because they understand that when the regulation is really weak, then of course he's risking to face a lot of questions on behalf of the public figures. Of course, there will be claims, there will be a lot of different remarks, and I think that right now our priority, our ultimate goal is to come to a more concrete understanding as to what kind of rules we should have for the regulation, for the legislation part of this matter. We need to understand the bottlenecks, the points that we do really miss. We need to understand what kind of amendments we're supposed to make in order to force our official and our authorities to go there and to take decisions. Well, you know, I think you're absolutely right in saying that there is a certain range of problems, and of course there are certain constraints. They need to be properly identified. It's important to fill in those gaps in order to allow the private capital to go further to the concessions and to work with them. And of course, in this vein, one of our main priorities should be private and state development and partnership development, and also we all need to focus on the state purchases sector in the right way. I think that it could really work as an impetus for further development, and specifically private and state partnership. We have already prepared a number of amendments, something that we really wanted to discuss with you in close cooperation. So we will keep on focusing on that regulation. But I would like to raise one more issue, and specifically funding or financing of the existing liquid profit that we have within the banking system and the Bank of Russia. Right now, the profit is over 6 trillion ruble, and right now the figure of its main budget is 90 billion ruble, and it's of course mostly distributed between the major Russian banks, 60% of it. And I would like to address this issue to the deputy head of the Department for Banking Infrastructure, VTB. What do you think? How we could attract more investment for infrastructure projects? What actually prevents us from using this liquidity and from using this to its maximum for infrastructure projects? Thank you very much for your question. As for the appetites and intentions of the financing organizations and financing investors in general, well, of course, it's first of all is to build up the financial potential and also to create the proper conditions for this. As for today, we do not have such conditions. We do have them within the Russian markets. They have already been created. Another thing is the legislation, whether or not it's really perfect for that matter, of course, but as it was previously mentioned, we need to think about its feasibility and also about its efficiency. Of course, we can use budgetary means to attract some private investment, but shall the government have the intention to attract some investments through private and state partnership and as well as concession agreement? I think that is something that could be really of great help. And you said that we have quite a good situation with liquidity, but as for the time that we need to attract this liquidity, this is something that we really have. From our perspective, we don't have any investment-related constraints. Of course, each project has its own individual assessment of all the possible risks, related to the fund generation. Of course, we do it every time we enter a new investment project. But apart from that, we also have an intention to build up our concession portfolio. As of today, for example, we have already there quite a number of full-fledged and high-scale projects, and not only concession agreements have already been signed, but also certain stages have already been accomplished in the framework of those projects that already can allow us to generate a certain profit. Being investors, of course, it is really important to draw a line between concessions and projects with a state participation, where the state actually acts as the customer. The main issue here and the question is to answer the question, what is the difference between a long-term project with a private investment and state purchase system and the system that we're about to implement now, when we take on risk and we understand that within a period of 20 or 30 years we want to enter this project as shareholders, well, and in fact to create a new enterprise, a new private business in the framework of this project, then of course it shows that we are aware of all the project-related risks, etc. We look at our own selves as investment at the share stocks, etc. Like a private business, you know, this we put it, but unlike the a classic scenario, it's a little bit different. Usually, yes, when you buy the already existing enterprise, you already know all the ins and outs of it. You already know about its everything about its profitability, etc. But when about some additional asset that you are supposed to generate, then of course you have to take decisions based on certain forecasts. You need to make an assessment of all the potential expenses, etc. For a very long term, and the way you will be managing them. Also to talk about capital expenditures, of course, in order to strike the right financial balance and to support this balance. This is exactly what you need to do, and especially if there is no state support. In this case, probably you need to so extrapolate on the possible need of co-financing for the whole period of maintenance periods, for example. But for us, this is so-called source of the early income. Of course, we bear maintenance-related risks because we need to comply with all the maintenance requirements, etc. Because there are always certain penalties in place when you fail to comply with them. Anyway, this is agreement that the new company will be using in future for the whole maintenance period and its whole life cycle. Right now, we think that first and foremost, from the point of view of the financial investors, it is really desirable to do that and to get from the state in form of a proposal a certain number of new projects. We would like to see more projects ready also at the approval level, that yes, they're really willing to work in the form of concessions. And apart from that, when you, for example, need a land plot and you want to work with single linear projects, and you know that there is a stretch, for example, from point A to point B without any geodetic survey, working documentation, etc., it is probably one of the most complicated situations, whereas you have to decide whether or not you will take on certain projects' risks. In this case, very often you have to reconsider some project parameters in order to still have some positive balance and positive economic trend within the project. But when it comes to the design documentation, when you work on it. Thus, for example, our colleagues from the transport sector who work with the toll roads in the sphere of this kind of projects, they say that they also work as very active players because they are involved in the design stage, in the maintenance stage, etc. So we also have to think about that as well. I would like to highlight once again that we really want to build this portfolio up. I mean, concession portfolio, both at the regional level and at the federal level. It means that we have the following dilemma. On one hand, you as a financial investor wants to have more clarity at the decision-making stage when you also decide whether or not you will enter this project. On the other hand, those who initiate the project, they very often have the following problem, that they find it really expensive to finance at least the initial stages, engineering stage of the project. But at the same time, we see that also funds that can be attracted from the market in general is also a tough issue. So what do you think about pre-commission or pre-project works and this kind of stage and the financing at this very stage when there is even less clarity than at the later stages? Well, of course, we do have such projects, and there we talk about such thing as co-financing. I mean, for example, let's assume that design documentation has not been developed yet, and it will be developed in the near future. So, judging on the international practice, I can say that we can allow for a certain efficiency at this point. This is a mutually beneficial process because finances for design solution, this is actually the foundation that's where we should start, because there you calculate all the expenses for the whole life cycle of the project. And very often we see that even if solutions are already there in place, still they cause a lot of, trigger a lot of questions. And this is one of the major advantages in this vein, both for investors and also for the developers. That is why we see that the main question is to understand how this project is structured from the risk point of view. So can you actually hope to get some kind of profit at the maintenance stage, and also to cover the expenses that we could not foresee at the very beginning? So if such conditions were ensured from the very beginning from the state, then probably we can take those risks on. Another scenario would be that we can say that, of course, we can prepare a whole set of working documentation and also agree to the cost breakdown, etc. At this stage, the state is supposed to take the solutions that go further, but at the same time we cannot cover and give any kind of guarantee related to the further expenses that we might have to make face to later, especially those who will be upon the concessor. So I think that here we need to look at from this angle, and later on, if the state is not satisfied with the concession form and the need to increase the investments payments, then there should be an opportunity to change the trend and maybe to take some other solutions, but to take a certain risk regulation and mitigation for this kind of scenario.
You've also mentioned about the measures of state support and about these forks on the road that we have, so to speak, about whether this state support is provided in the beginning, in the first stages of front-end engineering and design, and can this state support can also be provided in the future periods of the projects. What's your perspective? Do you believe it is critically important for most of the projects to get support at the very initial stage of the project? Or if this government support will be provided for the future periods, it will also be quite comfortable for the market, this scenario, which will not result in a significant decrease of the project's terms and conditions. You know, I would probably voice my own opinion, because whenever we speak about my colleagues from different banks, they are of different opinions, because many believe that without co-finances of capital expenditures, at least some of them, it's difficult to implement some of the projects. We do not believe that. Our opinion is different. If we are speaking about certain scale and scope of the projects, those that we know that have been implemented already, those which are being implemented, with exception of some mega large scale projects where a question may arise about the capacity and capabilities of our national financial market. For example, if we set a goal to fully finance from the extra budgetary sources the Moscow to Kazan, the very high-speed line. It's a railway line from the city of Moscow to the city of Kazan. With exception of these kind of projects, very few projects, I would say, very few examples when we speak about the trillions of rubles. Whenever we speak about billions or dozens of billions of rubles, we do not envision any, in terms of attracting financing, we do not see any need of co-financing of capital expenditures. Because if the state will enable for the concessor to get such a payment to return for their capital expenditures within 10 or 20 years, we're totally fine with that. Yes, we are taking more risk because it takes more investments, but this is the whole idea of this concession. We are deferring the revenues until we meet all the obligations and put the projects into operation. We are meeting all the requirements which are the must for the projects, and this is clear, and we know how to manage this risk because we have begun such projects as financial investors, and as the projects are being developed, we came to the conclusion that we need to build our own competences in infrastructure, in operation, and building. Now we do have these kind of capabilities. So I believe that definitely, without understanding a project specifics, to be able to say that it's all can be done with the extra budgetary funds for some one-off cases based on the capabilities of the state customer, if it has the capability or to meet their obligations in the long term to return for investments. We're also looking at that because some regional administrations, they are offering that, but then it turns out that this is too big of a financial burden on their regional budgets. But whenever we speak about budget capabilities, if there are no concerns and questions, yes, we are willing to work based on receiving the concession grantor payments in any horizon of time, in any length of the project. As for me, I would like to say that in this kind of arrangement, when the state is providing the support in the form of additional payments at the stage of the project or venue operation, we can also see some benefits for the state because, of course, in this case, the state is basically paying for the infrastructure which has been created, as it is already been put into operation, and in this way the risk of construction and risks of delivering into operation stays on the private part of this concession. And in a way the private party concession can better manage their risk and to see additional complexities and be able to take them into consideration to implement the project. On the other hand, I would totally agree with you that there are certain types of the projects which can be classified by the size of investments needed when some support is needed on the very initial stage. It's quite a difficult fork that we have to consider. We have to pass it and to make sure we do not create any drop in demand for the infrastructure investments within the PPP by providing very strict parameters for regulation when it comes to support the initial stage of the project. And I believe that here we have to still to discuss this matter with the market. Me and my colleagues in the government have also been a part of it to make a very balanced decision. Vladimir, Moscow is taking leadership positions in the ratings of the Russian regions by the development of the public-private partnership. As a ministry in the Moscow government and the head of the Department of Economic Policies and the Urban Development, could you please share what are the venues, what are the lines of the PPP projects implementations look very promising in your point of view? Thank you very much, Mikhail. It's true that we're paying a lot of attention to our investment policies, and on one hand, you would think, why should we do it? Because we have quite a big budget, and many projects we can finance single-handedly, both when it comes to transportation infrastructure and also in social infrastructure, which we have been doing quite proactively so far. But again, a question is open. Mikhail, you've started about that. You've been speaking about efficiency of investments. If we are to try to do everything at the expense of the budget, it doesn't matter how strong the budget is, money will never be enough to do the quick implementation of the goal. We simply will not have them. And when we make a decision of where to invest our money, the budget money, as a part of the targeted investment programs, we are answering the questions, what will be the benefit for the city? We have begun working back in 2010 by analyzing what the city of Moscow was lacking, what the city was lacking to breathe, to actively develop itself. And the answer was quite obvious. We were lacking infrastructure, primarily transportation infrastructure. All 70% of the funds have been invested into transportation infrastructure. The point is that any transportation artery, any Moscow metro station, it's always a new point of attraction, new point of growth for private investments. For example, this year we have opened already 12 new Moscow metro stations. All of these Moscow metropolitan stations gave a new vibrance, a new impetus to these local districts, and they've, of course, have been built, which is most importantly to enhance the quality of living of the Muscovites. But also these 12 metro stations are 12 growing points for private investments, which means new platforms, new stations, new changes and interhubs, where there will be built in new services and shopping malls, and new jobs will be created for the city of Moscow. And this is another tax revenue sources for the city of Moscow in the future. So the key question is how to choose, where to invest. It's about efficiency, and I would say a multiplier effect that we are receiving based on our investments. If we are speaking about the public-private partnerships, going back to what I began with, that of course you cannot build everything only based on the budget of the city. We have been elaborating on different mechanisms and different ways of attracting private money and private investors. And depending on what risks we wanted to hedge, what kind of result we wanted to receive, we've used different mechanisms. we are using a mechanism of the life cycle contracts. This is something that has been mentioned already. It's about efficient management of the process. Whenever we sign the life cycle contracts, we know that all the operational risks are taken by a private investor, and we are receiving today, here and now, the needed result, and then throughout the life cycle of this kind of life cycle contract, we will be compensating investors' expenditures, including the capital expenditures, for building infrastructures. We have a lot of examples. One of the big one was to supply the train cars for the Moscow subway stations. We immediately were able to renew our rolling stock, which we couldn't afford before. If we were thinking only within the framework of our budget, we have optimized our costs for operating these new train cars, and now we are seeing quite a big savings also in our current expenditures. This would be the life cycle contracts in IT technologies, and one of the lines would be the CCTV cameras, and also the current expenditures for the authorities, and also development of the software application, because any software application is the living organism. It's a living substance which has to be adapted to changing rules, to changing realities, and of course we can develop the product and then to order its upgrade, but we can, on the other hand, sign a long-term contract which will be including the adaptation and upgrading this product. The second mechanism we have been using proactively is, of course, concessionary agreements, but it's important to mention here what Yevgeny has mentioned. I totally agree with him. It's an issue related to preparing of the product itself. We have spent many time on, much time. It's abstract notion, but we've spent a lot of time and a lot of strength to develop concession agreement for the northern bypass road of Kutuzovsky Prospect. I am not aware of any other projects in the Russian Federation where building a transportation infrastructure will be done fully by a private investor and at the expense of the private investor. But this is possible only because each aspect we were trying to think and calculate ahead, try to foresee all the risks and going from the point A to point B. There are a lot of different stops and different things that have to be taken into account. We know that you cannot absolutely foresee everything. Concession agreement enables us, fortunately enables us, to be flexible about the situation when we put this project into reality. We can correct certain terms and conditions, we can correct certain parameters of the project so that the project would be implemented. And I believe that in the nearest time we will go to the construction site, and in about a couple of years we will see the final result. And at the same time, what else is important to point out about concession agreement? That each of the party has to be a partner. They have to feel as partner, and they have to take responsibility of the partner. It simply does not happen that you've built a company, one person is working and the second person is simply observing. Concession agreement is the same unless the state will feel as a partner, unless the state will carry a burden of delineating the risks or hedging the risks. The project will be virtually impossible to implement, in my point of view. We also have to understand that the private party is making money, but the city is also making money, and the city is saving money, the budgetary funds. And to saved money, the same as earned money, as the saying goes. So for any project, for any concession project, we have to take the approach of win-win approach, and we have to fill it with resources. If we are speaking about the problem which have been mentioned by Rachik Ashotovich, certain misuse and malfunctions which we are seeing sometimes in our practice in the Russian Federation, and the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service is dealing with it. Our answer is that the current federal legislation number 44 does not provide enough flexibility. It does not provide enough instruments to manage investment processes. And of course, there are cases when they're trying to hide some, let's say, daycare center construction behind the concession and to build it through the federal budget. But in many cases, it's a way to find an instrument flexible enough, which enables one to implement a project, because sometimes, indeed, when the project is fully polished from A to Z, all the pre-designs is done, all the risks is calculated, we simply don't have this kind of projects, especially when we speak about the multifaceted, difficult projects, transportation projects. This is not the case, because on the pre-project stage, it's impossible to take into account all the aspects and all the features. So I'm speaking about upgrading our legislation, and we have to understand that when implementing complex projects, we have to give flexibility to each party to the contract. Otherwise, the projects will not be implementable. If we're speaking about the city of Moscow, many projects we have to make through our subsidiary structures, because they are working outside of the scope of the Federal Law 44, but they're working with the Federal Law 23, which gives them enough flexibility, special lifestyle contracts. Our Russian Metro is working according to the law number 23. If had it been for 44, we wouldn't be able to do anything. Also, the building the former ZIL factory redevelopment projects. Each part is providing the revenue to the city for over 30 billion. It's also a result of implementing an investment project, which is a joint project. We are also doing it through our subsidiary, because the corporate legislation gives flexibility and gives possibility to build long-term relations with rights and obligations assigned to each party. So speaking about upgrading our legislation, what we begin our conversation with today, first of all, we believe that we have to make emphasis on that. And generally speaking, summing up our experience, we believe that we should not be afraid of investors. We shouldn't be afraid of trying different forms of investments. And in our practice, we are not only taking leadership positions, and thank you for a very high evaluation of our position on the market, but our opinion is that we were able to achieve that only because we have tried and we have tested all the scope of possibilities provided by the legislation. It's a rent, it's concession, this would be a life cycle contracts, and long-term contracts for state procurements. We were the first ones in Russia who tried the public contracts, our society contracts, which the law legislation 44 enables to do, and we had more than positive effect on terms of the savings on the procurement for medicines were over 30%, and the implementation of these offset contracts. As I'm finishing up, this would means the saving budgets not only for the city of Moscow, but it's important for us that it's not only so much as an investment, because investments into the jobs which will be created will not give us such an effect, such a benefit in terms of the tax revenues as the savings on the procurements. 4 billion rubles a year we are saving. We start saving since 2021. But the comparable amount will be also saved by the other regions of the Russian Federation, because after the launch of production site of the Moscow, the price from this factory will become a reference price, and all the other clients and customers will be benchmarking against it, which will entail the decrease of the price of all the medicals or medicines in all the regions of the Russian Federation. So we are saying that it's extraterritorial effect of the investments which will be implemented in Russia. So I'll say once again that the main and key condition, not to be afraid of investors. We have to try different mechanisms available on the market today, and we are ready and willing to share our practices, share our wins and our losses. Thank you for your attention.
Rocky Shotovich, would like to comment on that. Well, just a couple of words. What Vladimir Vladimirovich said is indeed very important in the scale of the country against the lack of the already made models, just like, for example, for the project life cycles, concession agreements, and other mechanisms of similar structure, which is private and state partnership. Well, Moscow by experimenting on that and making such agreements really create some kind of unprecedented practice, like we saw before in the past, and upon very careful analysis of the use of such private-state partnership in the country in general, we notice that when you start to repeat this practice again and to use the same methodology in the region, it becomes much easier, and regions they can use it as a role model, and thus it means that we can really set an example. Yes, when we take this project in the regions and say, yes, this is something that was implemented previously in Moscow, it really allows them to give it a try within a legal framework. It allows us to understand better some legal aspects and legal boundaries at the regional level, so that they are not afraid of such projects at all. It's absolutely crucial, especially when we discuss that and when we try to model this or that situation. When we do that, of course, first of all, we appeal to the pilot projects that are implemented by some of the leading regions, and Moscow is one of them. Thank you very much. In this vein, I wanted to ask you, what do you think? Rakev Ashurchevich has already raised this issue, but what do you think? Is it really possible to bring it to the private and state partnership to a broader scale? Well, of course, we know that it takes time to sort out some details or some issues, but are there any innovations that could help to facilitate the implementation speed? Maybe we need some kind of digital competition or some other tools. What is your perception? How do you view this process? Well, you know, as for the scale and also whether or not it can be turned into a massive process, well, I would say that here you need, first of all, to think about the business needs. Well, basically, we don't have here a need to work in certain industries, but we cannot always guarantee state participation in those projects. That is why when we take some basic legal aspects or law related to concession agreement, for example, for household amenities and their management, we see that there is a guaranteed demand for that, and also we do have investors there that can step in and boost its performance and efficiency. So we have some kind of an outlines which guide us and make us understand where to move. What about the obstacles? What prevents them from doing that? Well, when you want to launch any project, the main problem is uncertainty or misunderstanding of how it actually should go. Every time we step in the project where we don't have absolutely visible, transparent conditions, we get really perplexed. You know, for example, when we have ruble-based projects and when the entrepreneur is supposed to repair a building or to do some restoration, renovation works for a kindergarten, etc. So unless we discuss all the details and long-term perspective, investors are not ready to step in, to participate, etc. unless they understand that there is a cost time guarantee that they will be compensated for and there will be a payback later on. So I think that when you are sure that everything is going to be fine at the end of the day and long term, this is one of the things that could help us to move further in that situation. But this is something that you cannot do with relevant agreement, etc. Very often, you know that it's not impossible to cover all the possible expenses. Or when you talk, for example, of the projects, like, for example, the northern route, etc. I mean, the one that we talked about when we discuss the land plots and also the basic layout and mapping of the route. This is something that doesn't allow us at the very initial stage to cover all the possible expenses that we might suffer later on, because it always takes certain amendments, changes in the documentation, in the workflow, etc. It cannot be designed at the very initial stage. Another point is that, and Vashotovich, I think, agrees with me, our anti-monopoly department does not allow us to establish any kind of development with potential investment from the very beginning. Let's put it this way. Otherwise, we can be accused of some conspiracy plan. So I just want to say that you need to discuss all the details from the very beginning. That's absolutely important. Yevgeny said that you have to take efficient solutions from the very beginning, because it's actually serves as a precondition for further efficiency later on. And if a designer works without any link for the, for example, economic model, then he or she may put forward some solutions that are twice or three times more expensive than the already existing ones. It can really ruin the economic effect of the project. In this way, sense, you have to be compromised in order to avoid any conspiracy plans, which is of course inadmissible. But at the same time, you need to create some kind of mechanisms that could allow us to do some preliminary works in order to minimize all the possible risks and to add a little bit more transparency to the whole process. Thank you very much. It's true that that is very important comment, something to think about. But basically, in general, when we talk about infrastructure, we cannot but talk about, for example, fee collections and specifically a plateau system. You know, it was launched in 2015 and it replenished the budget for over 50 billion ruble. And in this vein, I would like to ask the chairman of the board of directors of the waste company, Snegurova Igor Adolfovich. So, considering your experience in the implementation of this project, as far as I know, the funds that you generate, they go right to the pool. And do you think that some of the investment infrastructure projects could be funded based on the money that we receive from that source? I would like to say that in this case, we talk about really considerable support on behalf of the state. We know that right now we are working on quite a number of different mechanisms, for example, support for the infrastructure and also the system of different guarantees. And the plateau system is one of the most the best examples here. And I would like to say that, for example, we have a region and we need to construct a road there, or for example a detour, road detour there, but at the same time we need to minimize risk at the same time. So in this case you can address this issue to after door Russian roads. In this case, they can use the plateau system in order to optimize all the risks. Three similar projects have already been launched there. For example, Khabarovsk, Novosibirsk, and Khabarovsk right now at a more advanced stage because road construction works there are in progress there, where funds are allocated both from Khabarovsk, from private investors, etc. But they are all in that project. Road infrastructure is a really driving mechanism, driving force for the economy. On one hand, it allows to minimize transport costs, but at the same time to develop the area in general. Thus, for example, in Khabarovsk, together with the Ministry of Transport as well, the Russian Federal Council of Direct Investment performed a lot of works related to the development of the area that surrounds this road. And as of today, we are about to sign an agreement in Vladivostok with Shandong High-Speed Railways. This is a Chinese company, a very important partner. We will be working with this company in close cooperation, and they will be developing the area along the roads, I mean that land plot. So they will be responsible for the constructions of different shops, gas stations, and so on and so forth. I would like to also highlight that we also have some goals related to the general development of the country's infrastructure. We want to invest a lot in that. Banks, of course, say that they do have the money to do that, but at the same time they ask for projects. They say, give us the project. We can see that the country in general is getting more and more ready and more competent, and private partners, they become somebody you are really willing to talk to, and you see that these people are really competent. Speaking about concessions and private and state partnership, I would say the following. This is one of very good instruments for the state. Khabarovsk spent some time to accomplish preliminary works, so it took both certain funds and time. But not every single region has them to do that. A good option would be to hand over a part of the scope of works to some private companies. Let's assume that, for example, we accomplish a part of works within the Moscow region, but one of the complexities of the Platon system is that the system cannot really analyze the readiness of the concession agreement. So to make an agreement, first you need to allocate certain funds, spend them, absorb them, then prepare a concession agreement, apply for certain assistance, and after that it's up to Avtodor to decide whether or not they will render their assistance. You could somehow change the rules a little bit, especially if you could see the whole picture from the very beginning. Then in this case, of course, there would be more willingness on behalf of the investors to participate and to invest their funds. Something like that. You said that you now working with a Chinese investor. There is common thinking that it's very difficult to negotiate anything with them and to attract capital from them in complicated projects specifically. How do you assess the perspective to attract potentially Chinese investment into those projects? Is it really feasible, and is it difficult for you to work with such investors? So, colleagues, first of all, I would like to say that when you try to attract an investor, whether it's Chinese or not, it is really it does really depend a lot on the investment climate. You know that not long ago a new amendment was introduced that actually about a new VAT, especially on for the concession agreements. And it was really adopted. It means that and it actually is applied to all the already existing concessions. It means to those concession agreements that have already been signed, they practically were made bankrupt. The situation is clear, and the state is keenly aware of that, as well as the private partners are. We do understand that, well, you can hardly apply it to the already existing concessions, and you cannot impose the VAT on them. So they decided at the governmental level to say that it is to be applied starting from 2019. Again, hence the question, is it going to be also applied in 2020, or shall we probably adopt some new piece of regulation? It means that you need to think twice before take this kind of decisions. First of all, it is supposed to help us with the infrastructure projects. We have been working with our Chinese partners for 6 years, and only after a period of 6 years we were lucky enough to see the first results. So whether it's a Middle East partner or an Eastern partner, we see that we always have some kind of mishaps on the investment part. There is something that actually slows down the process in general. It takes a lot of thinking. You need to take a balanced look on that. So on the other hand, a professional investor does really understand that Russia represents a very interesting market, and those working within the the infrastructure market, just like Chinese do. They don't understand that this is kind of a golden mine, because the road infrastructure is really needs renovation by 60%. Of course, it is interesting. No wonder people are keeping a very close eye on that. They negotiate different issues and also try to take advantage of the already existing opportunities, trying to look what they already have and what we do have and what we don't. But anyway, I think that we really managed to achieve certain level of success. I hope that a similar practice will be applied not only in Khabarovsk, but also it will be applied to quite a number of different projects with participation of our Chinese partners. Of course, it was mentioning that a huge contribution was made by the city itself, who very much supported the negotiation process as well as the state authorities, etc. This is just one of good examples of a private-state partnership. Thank you very much. It's a very important piece of work. And specifically when you also try to develop the area along the road, this is one of the constituents that comes in very handy. So it's very important to attract investment from the outside. I would like to wish you good luck, and I would like to say that, of course, we plan to support you further on. And now I would like to proceed to the traditional aspects of private-state partnership, and specifically cooperation in the sphere of digital technologies. You know that back in 2017, the President signed an agreement allowing the IT systems to become a part of a private-state partnership. According to the market data, it was estimated at 1.6 trillion ruble back in 2016. So the list of the entities and establishments working in the digital investors is growing day by day. I know that our colleagues from the Center for Perspective Development and Technologies in the sphere of IT, in the framework of the federal legislation, plan to create a certain marking and monitoring methods for that matter. I would like to give the floor to the head of the Center for Technological Development and Innovation. Thank you very much. I have a couple of slides to comment on that. Now a few words about the abbreviation that we use. Our center is a consortium of the Russian Technology Department and also the Center for Technological Perspectives. And actually, this is a company was created specifically to work with tracking and marking systems. This is exactly what we need for our project. Here we have certain capacity on behalf of Rostech, but we also have some opportunities that are provided by USM. This is one of the major employees for digital specialists. We have over 12,000 people working within the holding. It would be really interesting for us to prove ourselves in the sphere of a private and state partnership. And I would like to explain why. What is happening right now, of course, is guided by certain procedures. Well, we can say that de facto we have created some precedents based on some amendments introduced to the Russian legislation. So when we talk about the real physical infrastructure and about private and state concessions, well, the situation is quite transparent. There are no specific features, and quite a number of projects have already been implemented. But our projects might become the first project in the sphere of private and state partnership, specifically in the IT domain, and of course in the sphere of this type of partnership.
I will not elaborate a lot on telling you about the digitization and the advantages of the public-private partnership. I will say that we believe that public-private partnerships in IT is really different from the PPP projects when you build physical infrastructure. The reason being that we have a different risk profile, that we have to have different competences, which we do have, but still it's about building concession owners, and there is a high degree of uncertainty. And the involvement of a public partner, which is the Russian state, in this case, it's, I believe, also has to be of a different nature. What is our perspective about the markings projects? It has been mentioned here that building Moscow Metro is actually giving quite a big growth to the development of Russian territories and the regions, and the IT platforms and the traceability and markings of any platforms. It also builds a network effect for developing quite a big number of new businesses and the possibilities, and it eventually builds up the whole economy. Now, very briefly about how it works. So we have a basic level and additional effect or additional benefit for the state and for the consumers. For the state, this will be the fiscal benefits. I'm not going to dwell on it, but there is also additional benefits in the form of providing very quick and precise information. When we speak not about extrapolation, not about some other methods of measurements, but about objective data in the online mode. For businesses, this would mean to enhance their competitive level. Due to decreasing the level of the illegal turnover, you get the new market share. I'm not speaking about the decrease in the illegal turnover of the trades and services to the zero, but if we'll be able to have it, it also opens up incredible opportunities for the participants to these industries. There is also another benefit related to the data availability. For example, there is a federal law number 61 about the circulations of the medical substances and medicines. Last year, when amendments were introduced about the mandatory markings by the year 2020, pharmaceutical manufacturers were insisting on providing the accessibility to data about the tracing their data, what they have manufactured at the different stage of production, and this opens up opportunities for a totally different way of planning demand, or the Industry 4.0 and transformation of a logistical field. And for the final consumer, in addition to the basic benefit, one of the goals of the system is protecting people's health and lives. When we speak about the medical industry, we can also see the network effect, which is we place on very high bet on the development of the platform of public controls, which will enable each consumer not only to double-check their merchandise, but also to leave a complaint or to leave a recommendation, and also to take advantage of a number of other services. Moving on to what we believe is important in the public-private partnerships when it comes to information technologies of this kind. There is a high level of uncertainty, like I said, and we need to learn how to work with it. To build this network effect, we need data availability. If we speak about the specific requests for the regulatory bodies, we need not only to get the basic effect, but also to implement the network potential of the system. The data flow should be available for the analysis, and whenever I was thinking about what to say here, I didn't want to speak about the markings. I simply wanted to say of what is our perspective on why the IT market is so lucrative when it comes to public-private partnership. It is due to its network effect. Of course, we can see quite a big evolution. We can see quite a big development on this market. It's all started with data analysis about individuals, the big projects and other things. Now we have some movements about the culture things, sensors and meters, but basically it's an intermediary step in the evolution. If we move forward, we are moving to digital twins, and not only for humans. I guess everybody's speaking about this right now, digital twins for humans, and very soon we'll be able to take advantage of creating your own digital twin for, let's say, for investment purchases and many other things. Digital twins are also being built for the manufacturing chains, for the lines, for the movement of merchandise, goods, and services. And one of the examples would be the markings of the goods. Why the data availability is important. There is interesting statistics, and it tells us of how market distributes itself in terms of the data analytics and in terms of the AI, artificial intelligence. You can see it on the slide. You can see that correlations of the data availability with AI systems development is very high. And it's not for nothing that the 77% evaluation is that this will be the share of the companies, US-based companies, which can be explained about the legislation of the data turnover. And it would be impossible to get these additional benefits if you work with the system unless you use artificial intelligence enhanced systems. To use AI, you need data available for processing and for the analyzing. And the data availability, which is important to us, is also creates an opportunity to attract and to maintain those digital talents. Digital talents which we are lacking of already, and this deficiency will be growing unless you give people opportunity to work with data massives. People will be, I guess, preferring different locations in different countries for their work. IT is a global market, and the data availability potential creates quite big opportunities for the economic growth. About plus 1.5 to the GDP. It's as evaluated by the Boston Consulting Group. And as I'm finishing up, I want to mention what kind of platform Markings is creating. What is the Markings? It's all about. It looks like the digital twin is basically built to each unit of the merchandise, each SKU. On the level of manufacturing or importation, it gets a digital code which is being labeled on a merchandise, and then it's being traced throughout the whole logistics chain all the way until this merchandise is being checked out at the checkout zone in a supermarket. And we can use certain technologies. Even if there is no internet connection, you can do that. In addition to creating or decreasing the share of the illegal turnover, it creates big opportunities, both big data, like I said, at Industry 4.0. You can evaluate your risks, which should give an opportunity to bank lending for the SMEs, small and medium businesses, when you provide data for about the movements of your turnover and your merchandise. This can provide explosive growth of factoring on the market. And when we speak about the Markings, we speak about the e-document turnover. At all the stages, it will also be growing. This field is set to growth. And there'll be e-invoicing. E-invoicing will definitely fly in the future. It will be huge. And also for companies in FMCG sector, for the manufacturers, there is an opportunity to communicate with their buyer, because let's say if you produce mineral water or some soft drinks and pop, usually they use quite tricky methodology to get to their buyers, loyalty programs, etc. But here you can directly communicate with your customers. You can see the logo, Honest Mark in Russia. It's a brand which has been built for the B2C market. We are going to promote it at the B2C market in the media quite strongly in the next year. And with this application, you can double-check quite a big number of SKUs and merchandises, and you can also leave your complaint, and possibly you can enhance very good services. It's one thing when you ordered your medicine via drugstore or online source, but you can also use a QR code, or you scan your code for your medicine to see its shelf life and stuff, things which are of value for the final consumer. I think I will stop right here, because I have used up my time, but generally the benefits of the projects is expected over 1 trillion rubles a year if those commodity groups are sold, which were supervised, and it consists of the whole range of benefits both for the state and for business. We also should not forget about the opportunity of deepening integration on this market, which is also important to the market participants. And to finalize, I will go back again to what I began with. It's about the data availability. Data available in this system creates that much desired network effect. Thank you very much. And indeed, I can see quite a big potential and public benefits, in fact, from this project. But still, I would like to go back and ask you. You are, as pioneers, one of the pioneers of structuring PPP agreements in information technologies. How would you evaluate the convenience of these instruments? Do you see any pluses and minuses, benefits and drawbacks when preparing these projects and structuring such a projects in PPP format? What would you say? At this point in time, where we are today, we are in an official process. The proposal has been submitted. We are expecting some next steps of this process, and the Russian government has a desire to finalize the agreement before the end of the year, which is very, very fast. And of course, it will require some flexibility and a lot of efforts, not only from us, but from our partners. One field which is yet open, it still remains a question mark. And it presents a lot of uncertainty. It's a data turnover, the data circulation. Yes, we're building a precedent, and of course, on one hand, we have some huge risks, and on the other hand, if we close this data and not provide them for the analysis and turnover, it's like we miss a huge benefit which will be driving our economy. This is so much about your question, but about the form of communication and interaction. I would say that we are quite comfortable here. Thank you. Rachik Ashotovich, what is your perspective of IT segment in public-private partnerships? The prospects are simply explosives. I doubt that any one field has a similar potential to IT right now. I would like to point out one important aspect of this segment. In IT, as soon as a product is delivered to a buyers and customers, it hits the market, it has the risks of the redistributing revenue flows from the real sector of economy into IT sector of economy. The way it has happened with a taxi, you know, this Uber, and previously all the profit was at this private sector, and mostly the natural sector was developing. Yes, the conditions were worse, and now the Uber is better for the buyer, but it was a shock therapy for the taxi market when all of a sudden the prices began to drop. The new standards had been implemented, and the consumers got a totally different instruments and toolbox in their hands when ordering a taxi and getting their rides with the Uber or Yandex Taxi. It's a technological new wave in the whole sector of economy. As soon as we are beginning these IT concessions in the state investment systems, the key element that the state has to provide for, and our goal as the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, is also to ensure a proper demarcation, delineation, so to speak, of the natural monopoly parts from the competitive part. What I mean is, whenever we speak about the state information or investment systems, we say, okay, this is the system which our people are using, and due to our legislation, it's mandatory, and some industry of economy is going through that. As soon as we outsource it to concession, one private party is beginning to use this infrastructure component for its development and monetization. Monetization is happening not due to building services for the state, but due to additional services which can be sold by having access to a buyer. So as soon as we are giving out these concessions, we believe that in the contract, we absolutely have to draw the line where that non-discriminatory access should be for those IT businesses to this natural monopoly part. So the company which will provide or get an access to the infrastructure part, which will be common for everyone, it will have to provide non-discriminatory access to the competitive IT services, which will ensure that there will be no malfunctions on the market, that there will not be enough one economic operator which may totally redistribute our economy in the real sector. It's simply dangerous. This is why I believe that we have to work on that. That is, how can we formulate correctly that borderline which has to be drawn, where people have to have investment access. It's a very sensitive issue also from the terms of the margin, because if you put this demarcation line a bit higher, we give this moderator to get more market share or more sectors. Simply the margin grows by the orders of magnitude, and also the risks for the consumers are also growing. This is what I would like to point your attention to. Thank you. Mikhail, would you like to add something to that? In fact, I absolutely agree, because it's quite obvious when you build a platform-based solution. There is a risk if this platform is beginning to build this kind of specific services on this platform. These services, of course, can be considered by anti-monopoly bodies as those which have unfair preferences. And I totally support you in the fact that we have to divide between the platform and between the competitions. Have you made this distinction and difference in your proposal? We have been discussing this with your colleagues. We're still in the process. Thank you. Dear colleagues, we have a little bit of time before the session ends, and if our audience has any questions, we will answer these questions right now. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions? It looks like the discussion was quite exhaustive and complete, and most of the issues have been already worked through. So at this point, I would like to finish up our discussion. And maybe one of our panelists have any comments, anything to say to finalize. Okay, we don't have it, so I would like to thank our speakers and our audience for your involvement in today's discussion, and wish everyone very productive work today. Thank you.
Предсказуемая достаточно история, с данными сложность всегда большое количество разных законодательств. То есть гарантировать конкретную доступ к исключению всего, что может Китай, с данными и прочее, может не быть полноценно меняющейся законодательство. Thank you.